The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 14th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Soon a lot of people from the nearby villages walked around the lake to see where Jesus was. When he saw them coming, he was overcome with pity and healed their sick. Towards evening, the disciples approached him. "We are out in the country and it's getting late. Dismiss the people so they can go to the villages and get some supper." But Jesus said, "There is no need to dismiss them. You give them supper." The disciples responded, "All we have are 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they said. Jesus said, "Bring them here." Then he had the people sit on the grass. He took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, lifted his face to heaven in prayer, blessed, broke, and gave the bread to the disciples. The disciples then gave the food to the congregation. They all ate their fill. They gathered 12 baskets of leftovers, and about 5,000 were fed. This is the gospel of our Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
I'm going to go off script just a little bit to share with you a story of my own before I get back into my sermon script that was emailed out. When I was working in Jamaica as an engineer, there was a point in time where I wanted to learn how to snorkel. And I had gotten the snorkeling kit, and I used to drive out to this community beach that was in the country. It was about an hour and a half, 2 hours away from home. And there were a number of people who lived on that beach, literally lived on the beach. They had a little shack on the beach. They grew ground provisions in the land nearby, and they lived off of what they could get from the ocean. And I became friends with a group of about 4 or 5 guys who lived on the beach and made whatever income they made through selling little handmade jewelry and craft items that they would make. So if you can imagine, it wasn't a very huge income that they made. And a number of the guys who had this life on the beach were guys who had gotten into some kind of trouble in the United States or the UK or Canada and had been deported back to Jamaica. But they were, I'm going to say, from in the context in which I met them and learned about them, they were fairly harmless guys. And they were all really good swimmers. So our pattern became on a Saturday, I would drive out and I might take a little bit of food with me, and 1 or 2 of them would stay on the beach to prepare some lunch for us, and then 3 or 4 of us would go swimming. And it was a nice little beach where there was a reef, and if you could safely make your way through the reef, it got deep really quickly and there was really good snorkeling. And there was a time when I was able to come to that beach with a fair amount of food that I would bring with me to be cooked so that we could all eat. And then there was a time when I was working more freelance and I didn't have that much money. And I remember on one of those occasions going to the beach, and I went with one of the guys to the local grocery store, and we bought a small piece of salted codfish, which, not a word of a lie, was no bigger than my hand. And maybe we bought about 2 tomatoes and a small bag of flour. And we went back to the beach. We gave this to the gentlemen who were going to do the cooking. And the rest of us who were going to swim, we went swimming. And as we were swimming, I thought to myself, today we're all going to leave with slightly emptier tummies because it was a very small amount of food compared to what we would have been used to when I was in when I was in a better paid context and I could afford to bring a chicken or a bag of rice and a bag of peas to be cooked. So, anyways, we swam and we came back. And when we came back, there was a pot on a little wood cooking spot they had made. And that pot contained this small piece of salted codfish that had miraculously been stretched so that it made more than the size of my hand. And we had various ground provisions that had been boiled up to go with that flour that had been made into boiled dumplings. And we fed not just the people who cooked and the people who swam, but we also fed about 6 other people who made their livelihoods on that beach. And not one of us turned away from that hungry. And I don't know exactly how it happened, but I know that it happened because I experienced it. So I want to preface the written scripted sermon for today with that little story to remind us that when we take in faith the things that God gives us and are willing to share those things, there is an incredibly miraculous multiplier effect that occurs. Now, Jan read for us today the article that Anya Hageman had written for the March 2020 Canada Lutheran, and I took a piece of the article. I didn't take the whole thing. It caught my eye as I was preparing for our Lenten study series, and I thought it would be a good way to open the conversation. I took pieces of her article, and in the pieces that were read to you, Anya raised some hard questions, and there are questions I have thought of many a time. Could Jesus be calling us? Could Jesus be calling me to share my own home or my own housing budget? Could I rent a spare room from my house at a reasonable rate or downsize to a smaller home so that I could either allow other people to live here or afford to help others with their rent? These questions make me uncomfortable because they cause me to examine myself, right? I don't like to pay attention to them too much. So, of course, I thought, well, let's do this uncomfortable exercise together. Implicitly with these questions, what do I have that I could share with others whose needs are heavy? And in her article, Anya Hageman, who is, I think she's an economics professor, she gives 2 examples of cases in which she did share her home. The first one was when she was a graduate student and she had rented a 1-bedroom apartment, which she couldn't afford entirely on her own income. So she took the living room, I assume. That's what I did when I did exactly the same thing. And she rented the bedroom of her 1-bedroom apartment out. Because of necessity, she couldn't afford the whole thing. And for most of my life as a grad student, I shared my apartment not because I was so keen to have company under the same roof, but because it made things more affordable to split the rent. And in fact, if I'm honest, when school was over, when seminary training was over, one of the things I most looked forward to doing was not having to share and having the freedom to control the noise, the mess, the clutter in my own home. I'm willing to volunteer. I'm willing to leave my home and go into other settings and go and help others, but it makes me very uncomfortable to contemplate the discomforts of putting up with some of the strangeness of another human being who is not my family under my own roof. And so Anya shared that story about her experience as a grad student, but she also shared a story in her article about a friend who she and her husband sheltered in their home when they had kids. And this was a friend who had given some indications through some comments made here and there of the possibility of harming herself because she was at the end of her rope financially. Anya and her husband took this friend in at 0 rent to begin with, and then eventually at a subsidized rent. This friend became an auntie to their children, and it wasn't always comfortable or convenient. But Anya points out that Jesus' way is not meant to always be safe and comfortable. In fact, the way of Jesus is a way of radical hospitality. It is a way of taking whatever little food we have. Remember that little piece of fish the size of my hand, and sharing it. Taking whatever we have and sharing it. And in the time of the most vibrant and exponential growth of the Jesus following movement, for they weren't yet organized as Christians with church buildings and all of this. If you read the book of the Acts of the Apostles, we hear about this kind of radical hospitality. It was a hospitality in which people who claimed to follow the way of Jesus pooled their finances and resources and lived communally, and then these pools of resources were used to help other people. The people they helped were typically people who were right on the edges of society, and in that time, when you had a town, there would be a town wall or a town boundary, and literally the people who lived on the edge were on the margins of that wall or that boundary line. This was such a radical way of kindness and love. It did not depend on those being helped also believing in this Jesus character. So when resources were pooled and they decided to share this to feed people or to take care of people, they didn't say, well, we got to get those people to believe in Jesus first and then we will take care of them. This radical way created a tsunami-style wave of people wanting to know, over 2,000 years ago, wanting to know what the heck was going on, and then wanting in on this radical hospitality, this way of giving without first thinking about our own comfort and our own preferences. People came in droves to the way of Jesus. And if you read the book of Acts, they baptized people by the thousands. Can any of you, by a show of hand, indicate to me when last we baptized people by the thousands in our church? Not one hand can be raised. We have come a really long distance from that way of following Jesus today. And I know that there is space in my home that could be shared if I would be more generous. I know that there is food in my kitchen, heat in my home that could be shared if I wasn't so scared of what might happen to me, if I wasn't so scared of the risk it would put me at. And meanwhile, there are those who are cold, unsheltered, and hungry, sleeping within 1 kilometer of my own home, outdoors in this weather. And this morning when I woke up, my alarm is on my phone, my cell phone, and when I go to turn it off, the default screen on it shows me the temperature. This morning when I woke up, it was minus 17 degrees Celsius without wind chill. So that sits with me, and I don't ignore it, and I don't want us to ignore it, because I believe when we pay attention to things that are uncomfortable, we make room for the Spirit of God to work. We are not the first people who, as followers of Jesus, tend to dodge the call. Even when Jesus was mortally alive and physically in the midst of the disciples, they themselves often did not understand Jesus' idea of radical hospitality. And in the gospel story I read for you today, in the feeding of the 5,000, we hear about how, as evening approached, following a day of sitting on a mountainside, a day of teaching and healing the masses, the disciples kind of tug at Jesus' sleeve and tell Jesus, hey, it's getting late. Let's send the people home. Let's send them to the village to get their supper. And Jesus' reply, there is no need to dismiss them. You give them supper. The disciples then look at the very small provisions they have, and this story appears in all four Gospels, so we know that it was a child, a young boy, who was found to have this basket that held 5 loaves and 2 fish. I imagine his mom had probably sent him to deliver it to someone, and in his curiosity, he stopped to check out what was going on with this crowd on the hillside. The disciples look at the small provisions and they think it cannot possibly be done. But when it is brought before Jesus, miraculously it is multiplied. And not only are over 5,000 people fed, but there are baskets and baskets of leftovers. There are more baskets of leftovers than the basket they began with. So if we know that Jesus is capable of such magnificent, miraculous behavior, and if we really are followers of Jesus, why do we not share ourselves, our lives, our possessions more abundantly? Why do we wait for the government, the city, the region to do something about these problems? Is it maybe because we judge the people who need housing as too dangerous, too much to handle, too unpredictable, too immoral, too much of whatever it is that makes us uncomfortable? Is it because we fear that we will lose our peace of mind, our comfort, or our freedom? When I look into my own thought process on this, I can say, I think for me, it is all of these things combined with, no, not just combined with, but a hearty dose of my own need to judge. Why don't they just get a job and find their own way? Their families should be taking care of them. They must have people they can call on. They should get off those drugs and clean themselves up, and then maybe they could get a job and find housing. But we do not really know the story of the person we're judging, do we? We don't really know what is going on with them. We don't know the road that they walked to get them to where they are today, what caused them to be where they are today. And maybe we don't really believe that there, but for the grace of God, goes each and every one of us. Maybe we believe it could never ever happen to us, but it could. It is God's abundant grace and mercy that gives us every blessing we have. And if we understand the miracle of that generosity, if we can crack that enlightenment open in our hearts, we will recognize that even with 5 loaves and 2 fish, God makes it possible for miraculous feasts to happen, for thousands of mouths to be fed, for healing beyond our wildest imagination. And perhaps the greatest of that healing is the healing in our own scared, timid, safety-loving, scarcity-embracing hearts. So this Lent, I will be writing a series of stories, and they are fictional stories. I put fictional in quotes because in each of the stories I write is a vein of truth that connects to an actual testimonial I have heard from someone. And I have clothed these true stories in fiction so that you would not be able to connect the story back to the individual, so to protect the confidentiality of the people. I have worked throughout my life as a Christian and even before with people who have lived on the margins, and I've listened carefully to their stories. And the stories I'm writing share with you some of the things that I've learned. And this Lent, when you get those stories in your inbox as your homework each week, I want you to read them and also to look closely at the abundance that surrounds you and ask yourself how you could share from that abundance with those who are in need. The way Jesus tells the disciples when they want to turn the hungry away to go find their own food, there is no need to dismiss them. You give them supper. Amen.